Hey Burns, it's been a while. How you doing?
Doing as well as can be expected. I don't want to get bogged down, but as you know personally, as my close friend, I've had some issues of late, and I know you have too. So we both been kind of out of pocket, dealing more with doctors than with podcasts. So as I told you before we started this one, uh, I'm a little whipped right now, but I'll try to rise to the occasion.
Well, that's good. You know, I was going to let you start off, but I read an interesting cartoon, and it said rather than worry about Roe versus Wade, maybe we ought to start pushing vasectomies.
Oh, for God's sakes.
Yeah, and I found that kind of interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if you've thrown me a bit of a curveball. I have strong pro-life feelings. Well, beyond feelings, I mean, political positions. But anytime you get into that, we could have the people watching us turn it off for fear we're going to trample on women's rights. But my only comment or caveat would be that the human being in the womb has a right to choice as well, both under God's law and under the U.S. Constitution.
Well, I would agree with you 100%, and it really gets me when people talk about my right. Does that mean it's my right to run around and exterminate kids?
Well, the Democrats were unable to get it passed, but they had a bill before Congress this past week to extend abortion rights, through a full 9-month term. In other words, under this law, and irrespective of the viability of the fetus, from my point of view, at 9 months, it's not a fetus, it's a living human being with a heartbeat and arms and legs. But anyways, I won't go off into that. But they were bound and determined that an abortionist could take a life right up to an hour before birth, and I find that absolutely appalling. And the thing I don't understand, and then we can continue or get off the subject, Dick, but how can they be so cavalier about abortion rights and taking hundreds of thousands of lives? And yet, on the other hand, our Congress, run by the Democrats, is bending over backwards to open the floodgates at the southern border and let everybody in, trampling federal law with regard to immigration. And a good example of, I guess, where I'm going is we have this baby formula crisis, and something like 60 to 65% of parents with youngsters who would normally be consuming baby formula can't find it in their stores. This is a national phenomena, not isolated to a particular region of the country. But meanwhile, the Biden administration is stockpiling warehouses with pallets upon pallets of baby formula for the babies of illegal aliens crossing the border. And the other thing that it's somewhat, well, it's probably a bit unrelated, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. I get fed up to hearing about if you cross the southern border and by most counts, the order of magnitude is something on the order of 150 different nationalities. So it's not just necessarily a Hispanic issue or a Chinese issue or an Indonesian issue. I mean, we've opened the floodgates. We even have Afghans and Ukrainians and even Russians defecting and coming over and choosing to come through Mexico and cross our border. But if they're youngsters, they immediately get the moniker from the Democrats. They're called dreamers. And of course, dreamers, if you're not a rational thinking American citizen and you associate little kids with runny noses and the moniker dreamer, your heart goes out to them. But lost in the shuffle are the dreams that our children, American citizens, have, and immigrants who came to this country the right way and have become US citizens and followed the proper legal channel, and they have children. Don't they get to dream? Don't American children get to dream? We have something so out of balance and out of whack with a Democrat-dominated Congress and a president of the United States that have put Americans last, and foreigners, particularly foreigners who jump our borders, put them first. New York, the state of New York, is having to raise taxes on its citizens right now as we speak to fund healthcare for illegal aliens. They passed that in the legislature. Now they have to raise necessary appropriations, and they don't have the money, so they're going to have to raise the taxes. And that's but one example of the nonsense going on. I'll be quiet for a minute.
Well, no, because you just triggered a thought. One of my wife's nephews just graduated from college last week. You know, one of the people that came in legally, one of the people that's never been on welfare or anything else. And I'm sitting here going, this is the kind of guy I want to support. I don't want to support somebody who just decides they want to come over the border because the world's not a happy place. I know that sounds cold, but you know, you're right. I honestly think that we definitely need to take care of Americans first and those that play by the rules.
Well, Americans of all persuasions, harkening back to the colonial years, didn't defect and head overseas to get away from issues. You know, instead they tackled them and persevered and built this country. And what I don't understand, when you get past the Democratic Party propaganda and take a real hard look at the demographics of the people crossing the southern border, it's mostly males, and it's mostly males in their 20s, 30s. And these are people in their prime working years who could be making a difference in their countries of origin instead of running here as fast as they can to get on the government dole.
Yes, true.
And you know what? And I guess I'm circling back. Yeah, you know, the Democrats think that they best represent Black people. And Biden famously said during the campaign against Trump, if you don't vote for me, you ain't Black. You know, just an absolutely absurd, ridiculous statement. But abortion kills far and away a disproportionate number of Black babies, more so than the other major demographics of this country. And Democrats are absolutely behind abortion rights, Roe v. Wade, and as I just talked about a few minutes ago, abortion is having the right to take a life right up until a moment before birth. How should that sit with Black people? And why do they do this Pavlovian response when they go to their precinct to vote, or God forbid the new mail-in ballot that's become popular? So Biden got his 81 million votes, but it is a Pavlovian response to vote for a Democrat, much like Blacks have going all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt as an example, without thinking what are we truly receiving and what opportunities, not Obama phones, but opportunities are availing us because we continue to put Democrats in office. And I it's a mystery to me. I don't get it.
Well, I personally think abortion is murder. And to say, my body, my rights, I just don't buy into that. If people were really responsible, they'd use condoms, they'd use birth control, they'd use all kinds of things. But I don't know. I'm perplexed by all this because it doesn't make sense. It's so double standard. First of all, it's like, okay, you can abort somebody, but you can't go out and shoot somebody in a 7-Eleven, or you can't do a mass this or a mass that. I don't really see the difference. You're still killing somebody.
Well, where I thought you were going is if you walk into that 7-Eleven and you shoot a pregnant woman in the belly and you take her life and the life inside of her, that's a double homicide in almost all states of the union. So if the law follows in that regard, then how come abortion can be legal?
That is really an interesting, I never thought of it that way, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's, I guess, simply put, one of the great contradictions. So anyways, I guess my final word on the abortion brouhaha, and I think this has been really lost in the shuffle, particularly by the absolutely frenzied radical left. All the majority decision, if it's published as was leaked, would allow is that the decision on abortion rights would be returned to the states because the states best represent the interests of their people. So this notion that Roe v. Wade is being rescinded and that abortion would no longer be legal in the United States is utter nonsense. And it's just grist for the propaganda mill. But
Well,
that's not the intention of the Supreme Court whatsoever.
Well, let's look at another angle. I'm a big guy on cost benefit analysis. And something that comes to mind, recognize that the United States, like a lot of countries, is having a declining birth rate, which means fewer workers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. what benefit does society get out of abortions as opposed to what benefit would we get if they were outlawed?
Well,
Okay,
when you talk cost benefit, right now there is great pressure coming from corporations, but particularly woke corporations, and from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and from the very powerful, and by powerful I mean due to their lobbying efforts, high-tech companies, to bring in foreign workers, because they claim we have insufficient workers to man the available jobs here in the US. Well, look how many decades we've been aborting babies right and left. Are you telling me that of that huge number in the millions that technicians wouldn't have emerged, and civil engineers and architects and programmers, and what are we doing to ourselves?
well, that was the point that I was leaning into.
Well, there's such a thing as the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if you believe in the American founding and the precepts that guided our founding fathers, then first and foremost, life is a blessing from God, not from man. And I just think the notion of wide-scale, full-term, third trimester abortions is anathema to any right-thinking human being who values life.
I think that was well put.
Anyways, on to something. I think we've covered that subject, Dick.
Okay, let me move on to another one that just hit me, and that was Biden's comment on white supremacy.
Very good.
I told you this story, I don't know how many times. That's when I was talking to one of my grandsons who listed himself as white on the census. And I asked him why he did it, and he said, well, I wanted some of the perks. Well, what did I say? I can't remember exactly what I said, but I asked him ultimately, well, how's it working out for you so far? He goes, not much.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything. Well,
I know. He said he wanted part of the white privilege.
yeah, I've had a lot of that lately.
Oh, really?
I won't go there. I was going to be sarcastic. Look, it's real simple. Biden sits on his lazy ass, sucking on ice cream, unaware of what's going on around him until somebody like an Obama tells him what to do and fires up the teleprompter. But he waits and waits and waits. This is the man who is going to unite the country, because in his view, Trump divided the country, particularly with Trump's nasty tweets. So Obama was going to wrap his arms around, or excuse me, Biden was going to wrap his arms around the nation and bring us all together. Well, he hasn't done anything like that. And what he does in his Sharpton-like quest for racial divisiveness is, when there is a mass murder, he only jumps on those mass murders involving a white man with a gun. I mean, there are countless examples. One that comes to mind was the recent, I think 10 were wounded and 1 was killed in Laguna Woods, an upscale community in South Orange County. And it was a Taiwanese congregation. In fact, I think they rented the church for a particular function. And it was a Chinese immigrant who came to our country and obtained his citizenship, who walked in with a gun and started firing off rounds. Well, Biden didn't go out there and condemn Chinese brutality or Chinese racism. That's only the province of when a white guy does it. And by the way, the white guy who went into that ill-fated grocery store up in, wasn't it New York?
Buffalo.
Buffalo, yeah. He had close encounters with the police, with his school. He was known to authorities as having some mental issues. He was even, I think, for 2 or 3 days evaluated psychologically and then released. Now, I suppose in its purest sense, if a white man goes into any business and shoots up a bunch of black people, in some way, shape, or form, that's going to have an element of racism. I understand that. But to suggest or extrapolate from what happened in that particular instance, as Biden did, that we have a huge problem in this country with white nationalists and white supremacists and mega people. I mean, he was, casting evil with a broad stroke of the brush across most of the white population, particularly the white male population, and with total disregard for other crimes that have occurred. I mean, when's the last time you saw Biden jump in on a black on black crime, a black on black homicide? And they occur by the dozens every day in this country.
And they're the majority. More blacks are killed by other blacks than anybody else. But it's kind of, I don't know. I find it. Well, I just don't understand it. In fact, I was telling somebody, I don't even remember who it was, but I said, I just don't understand. I think my comment was, I'm just so sick of the race card. It's like everything that's wrong in the world is due to white supremacy or racism or something else. And I think that's a bunch of bullshit.
Yeah, well, so do I. And of course, what they're doing is, what Biden does is just the tip of the spear, so to speak. What's happening in a major way is that in schools across the country, they're insisting that white children take classes and be indoctrinated into the notion of white privilege and white racism, as if behaviors are ingrained and they have to be corrected by teachers. So from that perspective, it's to hell with the parents. The parents have no right. The school boards and the teachers have become the parents of record, so to speak. It all goes back to Hillary Clinton's misguided concept that it takes a village. I, for one, don't want a village raising my children or grandchildren. We can handle that just fine.
Yeah. Well,
anyways, it just, it irks me. And it irks me how a guy like Al Sharpton always shows up. You know, a certain set of parameters, and he's Johnny on the spot, yelling racism.
Well, you know, it's funny because you triggered the thought, and I mentioned it to you earlier. There I was watching the Buffalo thing and watching, I don't know, brother, sister, somebody. And there was Sharpton trying to push his way to the front. I mean, the guy's incredible. It's people like that that got us into that situation. And I think living in Hawaii, where we've got things pretty much under control, it's the people like Sharpton that create the divisiveness that we've got. And yet for some reason, you know, he doesn't pay his taxes, he doesn't do this, he doesn't do that. And yet every time there's one of these events, always black on white. I'm sorry, white on black. There's Al Sharpton.
And of course, the Hollywood celebrities follow suit. They're in lockstep.
Hey, but that brings up a question I've always had, and you're probably the best guy to answer the question. Why does Hollywood always come to the front? I mean, what's the deal? I mean, you know, I don't see that Hollywood has any connection to anything of any value.
Well, to a rational person, that's a spot on statement. Their contribution is entertainment. Some far better than others, you know, various gradations of entertainment. But should they be a sounding board for political views? I don't think so. I don't care what Bette Midler thinks. Do you remember, I think it was the last show Johnny Carson had, and Bette Midler sat down on the edge of his desk and sang to him. And, Johnny was very touched by it. It was a beautiful song. I still remember that to this day. In that moment, Bette Midler was doing what she does best. Now, when I see Bette Midler with her mouth as wide open as a hippopotamus and uttering a bunch of radical left crap, I have no use. I don't need to hear that.
Yeah, but
I know a lot of people far more educated, more prescient, more analytical, that can offer me some kernels of truth or cause me to reflect on a position I have and maybe make a navigational change in my way of thinking. But it's not going to be a Bette Midler that does that.
Yeah, but where I was going with that is, how did Hollywood get into this mold? And how do they even get involved? I mean, most of them are dumber than a box of rocks.
Well, a lot were very much enamored of communist teaching, back in the 30s and 40s.
So why would a millionaire, and some of the pay they get is unbelievable, why would they even buy into this? I mean, what are they?
I don't know. Ask Bernie Sanders. He has a pretty well-heeled stock portfolio. His net worth is well over $1 million, and he owns 3 very nice homes, including one on a lake. Ask the king of socialist communism, why he's enamored of it. I think it puts them in the spotlight, and that they're people whose minds would otherwise never give them gravitas in a community of well-educated thinkers. But if they get in front of a camera and assail, the people they choose to pick on, and the media is in lockstep and gives them a platform, suddenly overnight they're major news. That's been one of the failings of Twitter. Twitter censors conservatives and gives all the space and extols the virtues of the anarchist class. So,
well, the assumption would have to be made then that the only people they're alienating are people that don't buy tickets to their shows, whereas they're kissing up to those that who shows they like, and maybe that's the reason.
well, I mean, there are some conservatives, some gone now, like a John Wayne, and some current, like a Gary Sinise, and somehow, some way, they still prevail both in their careers and in their political viewpoints. But for the most part, I think it's a tough road to hoe for a proud conservative who is an actor, entertainer, to advance their career if their conservative political views are well known.
Well, I just don't know. I find it just absolutely amazing. Hey, speaking of which, and you were speaking of it, the good old conservatives. You got the guy, I guess it was in Virginia, who's under investigation for this, that, and everything else. And people are saying, well, it's not fair that he didn't get elected and whatever. I mean, what say you? I mean, these guys are nuts.
I'm drawing a blank.
The guy in the wheelchair, I can't remember his name. I want to say Crawford, Cowford, something like that. He didn't, by the way, make it through the primaries, but he's under investigation for, all kinds of stuff. And I
don't know.
I think Trump supported him.
I think Trump has had only 3 candidates he has supported who have lost. The overwhelming number that he's come out and endorsed have won. In fact, and I'm not saying this because I'm a huge fan of Donald Trump, but it is pretty remarkable. And I think it's more a reflection on the mindset of the American people with regard to what Biden has done to destroy this country so quickly, rather than it's some type of endorsement for Trump. That's just my 2 cents.
Hey,
there's been no one in our lifetime, Dick. And before you think of Jimmy Carter, Carter didn't even come close. Nobody in our lifetime has been this abysmal a president.
I would agree, but that triggered another thought. Remember, I was talking several months back, and now people are finally coming online. And if we hadn't had the stimulus checks, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we wouldn't be in this inflation mode, which I tend to agree with 100%. But guess what? The state of Hawaii is now going to issue checks to everybody for $300 because it's the economy, stupid. People want their money, and they aren't smart enough to realize what this is doing.
Well, you and I have talked on this subject, and I don't recall anybody getting up on their soapbox and saying, Dick, Bernie, give us more. So I I think it's lost on a lot of folks. But the federal government produces a budget each year and then ignores it. But they go through this kabuki dance on getting a budget passed, and then the minute it's passed, it's put on a shelf, it gathers dust, and nobody refers to it. What ought to be done in government, local, state, federal level, is zero-based budgeting. And I'll give you a good example.
Okay, hold on,
If
hold
you're
on.
gonna-
Hold on, for our audience, because I happen to agree with you 100%, but for our audience, first of all, explain what zero-based budgeting is.
Well, typical budgeting takes the prior year's run rates. And as an example, pick a number, $500,000 was spent on variable cost X. So then what the managerial planners do in putting together a budget and submitting it for approval is they look at that 500,000, they look at the inflation rate, they may look at some particular projects that relate to that cost, and they come up with some kind of increase off that base, as opposed to challenging why $500,000 was spent in the first place. Zero-based budgeting means if we were starting our business today, how would we construct it, organize it, market it, finance it? Where would we sink our limited resources for greatest advantage in the marketplace? And to do that, you literally start with a blank sheet of paper or a blank spreadsheet in today's world, and you build up from there. I mean, aerospace companies are famous for, towards the end of the fourth quarter of their fiscal year, they start doing all kinds of crazy projects, bringing in third-party contractors to spend a lot of money, so that becomes the new higher base to build next year's budget on. That sort of thing is rampant. Now, I'll give you, those are the general statements. I'll give you a specific. We Americans are being told that we need to send $40 billion to the Ukraine. Now, that's our money. That's money that could go to finance our kids' education, or to buy a house, or to trade in our 15-year-old car on a new vehicle, or to buy a dryer, or because another child is coming along to furnish a nursery. And what do private citizens do? If they need to do that kind of expenditure, they ask themselves, where can we cut back in other areas in order to be able to afford this? But have you heard or read a single article, Dick, of any government group, including the US Congress, trying to find where they're going to get $40 billion from without taking it from the taxpayers?
Well, no, and oddly enough, when you entered into this discussion, it was a perfect segue to what I was going to ask you. And the question then becomes cost benefit analysis again. I mean, 40 billion, is it good? Is it bad? What are the pros? What are the cons? By the way, I happen to support it because money gets wasted by all these government agencies anyway, and I would rather see it go to Ukraine than somewhere else. You know, it's like going back to how we won, maybe. Well, that's what everybody said we did against the Soviet Union. We could just outbuy them.
I think it was Senator Grassley, but don't quote me on that. But one of the prominent senators said this past week, with regard to the the $40 billion, how can we do that to the American taxpayer who across the board is suffering? Empty food shelves, the food products that are stocked are being ravaged by inflation. Fuel has gone up for 10 consecutive days. Diesel fuel is about to hit an all-time historic high.
It did yesterday.
It did yesterday, okay. And on it goes. I could, take up 15 minutes of the podcast just pointing to the big stuff Biden has screwed up. And the other thing is, there's been a history of corruption in the Ukraine. And so what Rand Paul, Senator Rand Paul out of Kentucky, to his credit, has demanded and not gotten, because his colleagues don't back him, is some type of oversight to make sure that money is spent wisely, and better yet, just to make sure we know where it got spent, whether it was wisely spent or not. And what Rand Paul is saying is that 40 billion will be shipped over there, maybe like Obama did with Iraq, on pallets with, metal strapping, binding pallets of cash. And it'll go right down a sinkhole and into Swiss bank accounts for the elites in the country. And the other thing I would say, and I would say this to you, Dick, because you spent a career in the military, even though this is the Ukraine's war, if we're making huge investments, it's become by default our war too. And in any war,
it's what one would call a proxy war.
Okay, fair enough. And in any war, we have to be mindful of what our goal is. And as a taxpayer, if I were sitting in a congressional hearing and being asked for my thoughts on the subject, I'd say, tell me, after we spend this 40 billion and however many billion more on servicing the war effort, then when peace does come, is the next move of the United States, sans any material contribution from the European nations, going to be the rebuilding of the Ukraine, much as the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe after World War II? And I don't think that's beyond the realm of possibility. And I think right now of dozens of cities in this country, and Donald Trump put it in very graphic terms. Sorry for the language, but he said we have many cities in this country, long governed by Democrats, that have become shitholes. Now, they go out from both parties and campaign and go into the destitute, desperate neighborhoods and promise this, that, and the other. And then they turn around and send 40 billion to the Ukraine.
Well, I think one of the...
Are we ever going to rebuild Flint? Are we ever going to rebuild Detroit?
No.
No.
But I think what's important, and I haven't found it anywhere, is I'd like to know where the 40 billion is going. We had talked about pumpkin stocks before, stocks we've got all through Europe that are just sitting there in storage waiting for the great NATO war or whatever. I would hope that when they say $40 million, they're talking about the cost of this equipment that's being turned over. I mean, absent that, we don't have a clue where the money's going. And I think ultimately you're right at some point in time. By the way, if you look at the Lend-Lease Act, for example, we didn't send money, we sent goods. And that's what I think we ought to be doing now. Give them a ship, for example, to blow the Russians out of the Baltic. These Javelin missiles, they're all coming out of storage. Hopefully those types of items are being charged against 40 billion. I mean, if it's not doing that, then it's criminal, because you're absolutely right. Ukraine has a history of corruption, as do a lot of countries in Eastern Europe, particularly, excuse me, once the wall fell. But we need to account for every penny. We just can't, send them a check for 40 billion, another 40 billion, another 40 billion.
Well, the last thing I would say on the subject is look at the 40 billion with the state of the nation as a backdrop. I mean, I, for one, have long questioned foreign aid, how it's handled, the rationale for it. As you well put, cost benefit analysis of, sending India, pick a number, $100 million for X. But look, there's hardly an area in our country today that isn't in desperate trouble. And I would say this is the time that the US has to hunker down a bit until we find the wherewithal and the people to pull back on the throttle and get us back on track. And by back on track, get the inflation rate under control, get back to energy independence, get the southern border closed and secured, beef up police departments, lower the crime rate, particularly the homicide rate, and on it goes. It just seems to be incredible that at this point in our nation's history, we're falling all over ourselves. Hell, we're giving money to Venezuela, for God's sakes. That Biden's sending money to Cuba and to Venezuela, and his rationale is he thinks that'll bring back Hispanic votes that he's lost to the Republicans.
No,
So,
what'll happen is you'll have the corruption in Venezuela that they've always had, and the money will just go down the tubes.
right.
You're absolutely right. That was one of the dumbest, stupidest, whatever things that he ever could have come up with. But when you're surrounded, don't forget, a leader is only as good as the people he surrounds himself with. And when you surround him by Buttigieg and some of the others, you really wonder what kind of advice he's getting and whether or not he's got the judgment to make decisions from that. And I would argue that A, he surrounded himself with idiots. B, he doesn't have the wherewithal to determine what the best courses of action are. And see, that's the way the military operates. You come up with a plan, you come up with courses of action, you look at the pros and cons of all the courses of action. I don't see that happening.
Yeah. Let's see, I got one other thing I'd want to bring up, if I may. We have Chuck Schumer out of New York, the infamous senator, calling for the I don't know if this is the right term. I'll say the dissolution of Fox News. He doesn't want to just censor it in part. He wants to take it down. What business does a U.S. senator have of curtailing freedom of speech? And by the way, and I've said this in previous podcasts, I'm not the fan of Fox News I used to be. And I could devote a podcast to explaining why, but I'd probably bore everybody. But I seldom watch it. I like to watch Gutfeld's opening monologue at night on his new talk show. but I don't stay with it beyond his opening monologue. And on occasion, depending on what Tucker Carlson's going to talk about, I'll tune him in. And I don't always agree with Tucker Carlson. But beyond that, I don't watch Fox News. But Fox News has every right to be there. And by the way, I'm a thinking American with a good mind, and I can make my own damn decisions as to whom I'm going to watch and who I do not want to watch. I don't need Chuck Schumer's big nose stuck into my decision-making in my own family room.
Are you saying then that what the public should do if they don't like something is to push the off button?
Yes,
God, that's a radical concept.
it's kind of like a vote.
Well, yeah, but do we have the ability to properly use the on-off button? Or do we need people like Schumer to maybe do it for us? I'm being sarcastic.
I know you are. Anyways, Chuck ought to stick to his,
Okay, well, I think maybe we should quit on a high point
okay.
because we've gone around and around and around and oh, did you watch
My grandson, 22 years old and playing his final collegiate series. And when we started the podcast, they were still playing, but he's had a single, a home run, and a double so far, as I know.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So
Why? This brings up an interesting point. Why is he so successful? Do you suppose it's maybe white privilege?
undoubtedly,
Okay,
yeah. But I have a question in that regard, Dick.
yes.
Do you think if he chose basketball over baseball, white privilege would do him any good?
No. In fact, what I was going to say is think of all those black players that he's putting out of a job. I mean, he needs to put some serious thought into that. And I think with that being my final comment, we should say goodbye until next week. Oh, wait, maybe not next week. It'll depend because we hope to go to Canada next week.
Lucky you.
Put off for 2 years.
Okay. Well, you let me know, and if you end up going, I wish you a wonderful trip, you and Millie.
Okay, thanks much.
Okay, you take care, Dick.
Thanks, same to you.